Today's reading is from Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 to 9. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words, and as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had bricks for stone and the bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its tops in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." The Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the mortals had built. And the Lord said, "Look, there are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand one another speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there and over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth.
Thank you, Irene. Mythical stories are important in every culture because they create spiritual or theological frameworks that foster collective thinking and cooperation in communities or societies. When they're viewed as metaphors for deep spiritual truths, the stories, the myths, and the legends of a culture can offer wisdom and provide a useful moral compass. Last week, we looked at the story of Cain and Abel from 4 different perspectives: the literal, symbolic or metaphysical, the socio-historical, and also through a social justice lens. We discovered that although we can find many useful spiritual teachings, even those that are useful for us today in Alberta in 2020, a literal reading of these prehistoric stories is often limiting, as an even cursory reading offers many areas where the story would fall apart quickly under the slightest scrutiny. This is why when it comes to stories like Cain and Abel, Noah and the flood, today's story, the Tower of Babel, their benefits can truly be found if the stories are understood symbolically rather than as literal historical fact. As we found last week, literal interpretations often contradict each other, and they don't necessarily align with history anyway, which leaves a literal reading sort of confused and contributes to a lot of conflict. So that's why it's important for us to look at our sacred stories through the lens of critical historical inquiry, instead of through the limited scope of literalism. As we touched on last week, if we were to take First Testament stories literally, we would be worshiping a God that expresses some of the worst qualities of what it means to be human, like jealousy and sexism, irrationality and violence, just to name a few. Current biblical scholarship is generally in agreement with the idea that most of the First Testament was put into writing as opposed to simply passed on orally during the Jewish exile in Babylon, which leaves a pretty big gap between the written record of the stories and events that took place thousands of years earlier. Richard Friedman, he is a biblical scholar and a professor of Jewish studies, and he wrote that the land of Judah is actually a very small village that was basically insignificant compared to the enormous power of Babylon and Egypt. So to establish a presence that could compete with other nations, Judah's early leaders and priests, through their oral tradition of storytelling, created the idea of an all-powerful God that took a special liking to their tribe and promised to make them into a great nation. This idea was expressed in the writings of the scribes who found themselves in exile despite the promise of God's favor and protection. In writing their stories, scribes justified this devastating loss of status by assuming that they were being punished for displeasing God. Friedman explains that in pagan religions, where there are many gods, if another nation defeats you, you can chalk it up to their fact that their God was simply more powerful than your God. But in monotheism, when there is a belief in only one God, if you're suffering, the logical conclusion is that you must have done something wrong. So because the Pentateuch has only one God, and sidebar here, Pentateuch is a fancy pants word that simply means the first 5 books of the Bible. So the Pentateuch... I'm preaching today, Kurt. So the fancy pants word... Pentateuch simply means the first 5 books of the Bible. So we're talking Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So because the Pentateuch has only one God, and the children of that God were not as faithful and obedient as required, punishment would have seemed like a logical conclusion. And this punishing, reactive type of God is reflected in the story this morning when we read it on the surface level. What we know for sure from this story is that people have decided they are going to build a tower that reaches very, very high so that they can, quote, make a name for themselves and not be scattered all over the earth. God comes, God sizes up the situation, and decides that if they do this, nothing will be impossible for them. They'll be able to do anything. So God says, let's go down and confuse their language so that they won't be able to understand each other. God does this, they stop building the city, and they're scattered all over the place. And that's it. That's the whole story. So I think we can admit the story's a little bit weird, but let's remind ourselves to look below the surface of this story, beyond a literal reading, beyond just the words on the page. First, let's start by putting this story in context of where it is in the Bible. So Genesis began in chapter 1 with the first creation story where God created the world in 6 days and then relaxed on the 7th. Then in chapter 2, we have the second creation story with Adam and Eve, and then we carried on, and then last week we talked about Cain and Abel, which came next. So after Cain and Abel in the book of Genesis, there are long lists of family lines. Then the story of Noah and the flood, and then some more lineage stuff, and here we are at the story of Babel. Now, if we were to go back 1 chapter to chapter 10, we would find a long list of so-and-so was the father of so-and-so was the father of so-and-so. And now in there in chapter 10, if you look kind of in the middle, you will see the following. Cush was the father of Nimrod. Hilarious name, I know. So Cush was the father of Nimrod, who became a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mightier hunter before the Lord. The first centers of his kingdom were Babylon, also known as Babel, Uruk, Akkad, etc., and academic linguistic types have noted that the name Nimrod, as hilarious as I think it is, actually stems from the Hebrew root word for rebel. This is significant when we get to the story about the Tower of Babel. We know that, following the storyline, it's being built by a very violent and powerful warrior who is also building lots of other cities, and his name is connected with the idea of rebelling. We also know that they are making this tower out of new technology. We are specifically told that they are using bricks and mortar, which, unlike stone or anything else that they had been using to make stuff at that time, is brand new technology. Someone invented bricks, all the same size and weight and dimensions, and mortar to keep them in place. And now they could build and make things that they were never able to build and make before with the new technology. Ultimately, we can, one, see this as a story about technology, how it can be used for good or for evil. How a powerful warrior who's building empires can use technology to begin to set himself up like a god. We can see this also as a story about how as people scatter and spread, some were gaining more power and influence at the expense of the others. This we know is true. This happens. We see it all the time, even in Alberta in 2020, the struggle to support local businesses as large corporations swoop in the same area with their low prices and millions and billions of dollars to back them up. Like, we see this on a day-to-day scale, even though this is a story from prehistory. We can also see this as a story about the perils of technology. And we can spend all day long talking about how terrible social media is and how people never look up from their phones, etc., etc. But to be honest, that's not a conversation that I'm particularly interested in. What interests me is the motivation behind building the tower. We know there were powerful people conquering and rebelling, but the wording is actually sort of interesting. Now the world had one language and common speech. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered all over the face of the whole earth." So the motivation is fear. And let's be real, when we look at the most powerful of figures, we know there's always an element of fear underneath some motivation. Here, they were afraid of being scattered all over the earth. What they wanted to avoid is the very thing that God graciously and beautifully does, the blessing of the diversity of nature and nations and all of creation. By choosing to remain together in their safe existence, where they're all the same and they all speak the same language, it went against God's purposes. Walter Brueggemann, near and dear to my heart, who is a very big deal in the world of biblical scholarship, he wrote this: "The fear of scattering is resistance to God's purpose for creation. The people don't wish to spread abroad, but they want to stay in their own safe mode of homogeneity. They try to surround themselves with walls made of bricks and a tower for protection against the world around them. This unity attempts to establish a cultural, human oneness without God. This is a self-made unity in which humanity has a fortress mentality. It seeks to survive on its own resources. It is a unity grounded in fear and characterized by coercion. Because a humanity without God's will is likely to be ordered in oppressive conformity. Oppressive conformity. To a people who wanted to stick together in the comforts of their safe, homogeneous, self-serving existence at the expense of God's mandate to be a blessing to all nations, God comes into this story and says, get out of your comfort zone. Get out beyond these walls that you've built for yourselves to keep yourselves safe and comfortable and completely the same as you've always been, doing it the same way you've always done it. Get out and see and be in the rest of the world. This is a story from prehistory, millennia before Jesus even came. And it's a story about today. In what ways are we knowingly or unknowingly behaving like those constructing the Tower of Babel? This is a sacred story, and it's also a warning. Have we cocooned ourselves safely inside communities where everyone looks and sounds and talks and speaks just like us? Have we surrounded ourselves only with those we more or less have the same culture, political views, religious beliefs with? Is our sacred space here that we have built and created, where we proudly and loudly proclaim that all are welcome? Are we truly welcoming for those who don't look or think or behave the same way as us or have the same abilities as our majority? Do we quietly wish for conformity when God's dream for us is and always has been from the beginning of creation itself, diversity, celebrating difference? Just some questions that I'm wondering about. But may we hear what the Spirit might be saying to the church in Alberta in 2020, even through this sacred story from prehistory. Amen. Amen.